Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Homo Complexus podcast with your host, Richard. Today, we are going to talk about, one of the biggest elephants in the room, in the world today, I believe anyway. And that is the reason that the British Empire essentially came to dominate the world. It is not the story that most of us know. And I really my hope is that in the next few years, this story will change, and that most Europeans, most Westerners will have this, like, the actual truth more baked into their consciousness, because it's a bit scandalous, and it doesn't make us feel that good about ourselves, at least a lot of British people. So let's get straight into it, right? Sitting here, in Melbourne, Australia, as we went through in the last episode, the remnants of the British Empire. Let's see how it actually came to dominate the world. Aside from, I'm not making a moral judgment here or anything. I'm just going to present, the actual factual story. Okay? So, it all starts with the British East India Company, which I mentioned in the last episode. This was a private corporation, one of the first that was funded by shareholders. It's very old. It started in 1599. That's, the time of Shakespeare and Queen Elizabeth I in London, in England. And its mission was to trade spices from the Indian Ocean, from India, from modern Indonesia, back to Britain and back to Europe. That was its initial, foray out into the market. That was in 1599. Now, in 1615, we have a chap called Sir Thomas Roe, who's this envoy of the British East India Company. And he's the first company official to go to India. Now, India at this time was under a very exceptionally wealthy dynasty called the Mughals. At the time of Thomas Roe's visit, the Mughals, under their emperor Jahangir, had, by far the richest empire, for want of a better word, on earth. 40% of the world's GDP, roughly, as far as can be estimated, was produced in India. Especially, in three particular provinces or regions: Bengal, Bihar, and a place called Orissa, which is today called Odisha. Now, this is all, if you don't know your Indian geography, I don't blame you. If you're Indian or from the subcontinent, you will know this, but Bengal and these other provinces, Bihar and Odisha, are in the northeastern corner of India, near Bangladesh. And they are in the plains where the many mouths of the massive Ganges River pour out into the Bay of Bengal. So we can sort of see how this area, this very fertile land, produces a lot of this wealth. And I want you to keep in mind, the Mughal Empire had exceptional amounts of jewels, gold, material wealth. But the Bengali weavers and the textiles that the Mughals produced were exceptionally highly sought after. All over the world, the European royals were in those classic four-poster beds that we all know. These textiles, these linens, people's clothes essentially came from India. Essentially, now we have the association of, a sweatshop which says made in Bangladesh. So clothes are still coming from that region. But this was in a completely different way, right? This was under the auspices of the Mughal Empire. It was very profitable time for the majority of the Indian subcontinent. We're not going to go down the rabbit hole of Mughal Indian politics, which at times was extremely bloody and violent, but very, very rich place. So I wonder what happened when when the British took over India? Where did all that wealth go? I think you can make up your own mind about that. But let's keep going with this, notional timeline. 1615, so Thomas Roe visits the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, and there's a famous painting by Jahangir's personal artist at the time, the sort of court artist. And you can see in this painting how diminutive, how completely irrelevant the Mughals think that these British are, because it's a very regal painting of the emperor, and right in the corner of the painting is Thomas Roe, right at the bottom. The artist, I think, even draws himself or paints himself in this painting, and he's almost the same size as Thomas Roe in the corner as well. So that gives you a bit of an idea. So 1615, this visit happens, nothing really comes of it. 1639, we have what is called Fort St. George at the time, but what later will become Madras and what is today called Chennai. 1661, we have British company officials essentially trading and setting up warehouses and so forth, what they called factories at the time. But factory then does not mean what factory means now, post-industrial revolution. Factory just meant a big warehouse where goods were stored, around which factors, people called factors, lived, and they were essentially just merchants, right? Getting Indian goods, paying for them with British money, British silver, essentially what they call silver bullion, just British coins were being shipped over from Britain to these factors. The factors were using that to pay for Indian goods that British people wanted, which there were a lot of. And the Mughals were sort of allowing this because the British weren't causing any trouble at this stage. They were just confined to a couple of coastal outposts, none of them were going inland, and they were just buying, Indian stuff. So by 1690, when a place called Fort William was built, very close to modern day Kolkata, or right in the center of it, the British essentially only had 3 outposts, trading outposts. And remember, when I say British here, I don't mean British government. I mean a private corporation called the British East India Company, okay, who act purely for the good of their shareholders and are essentially a profit-based company like any company today. So by 1690, we have Kolkata, Bombay, and Madras. Now, the British in 1690 think that they can start getting away with stuff. And they try and, stage a little revolt against the Mughals. This, all-powerful empire that controls, almost half of all the world's economic wealth at this time. And the emperor at this time, 1690, is a very, violent, can be anyway, a very violent man called Aurangzeb. And Aurangzeb absolutely crushes the revolt, kills a lot of the British. I can't remember exactly the nature of the revolt. I think they were just trying to, not pay taxes and things, and maybe they tried to take a bit more land than what the Mughals gave them. Who knows? Not really important. The important thing is that the revolt goes nowhere. Aurangzeb completely crushes it, and these British have to go to the Mughal capital, far inland, and they have to essentially lie flat down on the ground, prostrate themselves in front of the emperor, kiss his feet, like literally kiss his feet, and beg for forgiveness. And the emperor says, whatever, go back to trading. Stop causing me any trouble, you little mosquitoes. This, if any of you have listened to my Inca series, this sounds a lot like when the Spanish get to the great Inca in South America, who also sort of disregards them as, just these people who are not going to cause him any trouble. And in Aurangzeb's lifetime, unlike with the Incas, he's completely right. The British stay highly irrelevant. However, in 1707, Aurangzeb dies, and the Mughals did not have what is called primogeniture. This is a thing that makes sense to us in the European world, but this was not a Mughal custom. Primogeniture just means, the first male heir succeeds the throne. There have obviously been queens and stuff in Europe too, but it's normally the male heir. And the Mughals don't have this. The emperors, who are the Mughals, were a Muslim dynasty, originally from Central Asia. The first Mughal emperor, Babur, was actually born in Kabul in Afghanistan today, and his tomb is still there. But they had, due to this, Muslim tradition, they had many wives, unlike the Christian church didn't much like that in Europe, that idea. And this meant that there were many offspring. And a lot of these would have to fight it out in a big succession battle every time an emperor died. And there was an especially bad one in 1707. And the Mughal Empire sort of fractured and was not the same after Aurangzeb dies. Now, if any of you remember my Kohinoor Diamond episode, what number was that? Curse of the Kohinoor, episode 9, pretty short episode, so you can go back and listen to that one if you've forgotten. In 1739, a mere 32 years after Aurangzeb's death, we have Nader Shah, a very dark age in the history of the Mughal Empire and the history of Delhi, the capital in particular, because Nader Shah, this warlord from Iran who we've heard about many times in other episodes, comes and just lays waste to a highly weakened Mughal state because this emperor Aurangzeb has died recently and there's been a big succession struggle and it's still struggling. Nader Shah almost wipes Delhi off the map, loots all the jewels, and obviously takes the Kohinoor diamond, which now sits in the English crown jewels in the Tower of London. And 1739, by this point, after the big looting and sacking of Delhi by the Persians, essentially, the Mughal Empire, northern India, and parts of the center are really, in political disarray. And who should step in but the British at this point? Always seem to be perfectly placed to take advantage of these things. And the person to do this, who I don't think really people in Britain know about, maybe they do, he's sort of a genuinely like a Lord Voldemort character. The story arc is very similar to Tom Riddle in Harry Potter, because this boy essentially is 18 years old when in 1744 a guy called Robert Clive arrives in India as a very lowly company official. Now, Clive's life until this point has been pretty messed up. He comes from near the border of Wales in England, grows up in a small town, and he's just a complete nuisance of a youth, always bashing people up. He forms what's called a protection racket with some fellow town bullies, where he just threatens to burn down people's shops or attack them and loot them if they don't pay him money. He's a real just grub, essentially, and his parents don't know what to do with him. They have a bit of money and they send him off. They essentially just send him to this the equivalent, dare I say it, of like an EY internship, right? That he goes to the East India Company as an intern, the lowliest position, except in that time, you got sent off to India. That was, maybe an even better idea for Clive's parents, because the town was now rid of this bully. Anyway, he reaches India, he's deeply depressed, he hates his life, maybe hates himself deep down. And he suddenly finds himself in an environment where these, bully, thuggish talents, and he's not a complete idiot, Clive. He knows how to play people. Maybe he got this from the street in his small, Welsh bordered town in England, who knows. But soon after his arrival, he becomes a soldier and he fights the French in India in what are called the Carnatic Wars. So the French are also trading in India, and they are also trying to take advantage of this fractured Mughal state. And it's sort of a competition between a French private company, which is not completely private, that's a lie, because the French monarchy is controlling this. And this is, pitted against the British East India Company, which the English monarchy essentially has no control over because it's controlled by a board of directors. And whether that's the main reason, whether there are other reasons, the British, with Robert Clive as one of its soldiers, end up beating the French in a lot of these skirmishes in India, especially the south. Remember, at this point, the British are only in Kolkata, Madras, which is Chennai, and Bombay, which is Mumbai. Those are essentially the only three bases that they have that they're just using for trade at this point. But they start to militarize here because they're fighting the French. Okay, and then we have an outbreak of one of those classic European wars that doesn't really get much airtime nowadays because we just talk about recent stuff, World War I and World War II. It's called the 7 Years' War. And maybe because it's in the 18th century, the 1700s, people have sort of forgotten about it. But in this story, in my opinion, it is, one of the centerpieces of why the British Empire became, the empire on which the sun never sets. This is literally it. Okay, so 1756 to 1763, it's the 7 Years' War. And I quickly looked up the alliances that were happening here. We had Britain, Prussia, which is, the precursor to the German state, and some other, German duchies and stuff on one side. And then we had France, Austria, Russia, Sweden, and even Spain on the other. And as we know, the Spanish, the French, the British have colonies, all over the world by this point. So this war, the 7 Years' War, was, it should be called the First World War. It just happened a bit early for, our consciousness to rename it. And there was fighting on essentially every single continent on Earth, barring Antarctica. And a lot of the fighting was happening, as we said, in India. Now, Robert Clive is in the middle of this, right? So he was 18 years old when he arrives in India in 1744. He's, 12 years later, he's about 30 years old, prime of life, when this 7 Years' War breaks out. But remember, he had already fought a lot of skirmishes by this point against the French. So he was a bit of a battle-hardened bloke by this point. And by this point, the French have largely been beaten back by the British. Again, I don't want to make everything about war. This episode, unfortunately, will focus a lot about war. But I think it explains, one of the critical things that people don't understand about the British Empire. That essentially India was its golden goose, and that the capture of India was the center of everything. Center of the Industrial Revolution even, which I'll get into. But it all starts with Robert Clive, okay? 1757, there's something called the Battle of, which should be called Palashi, but which has been, anglicized into Plassey. Palashi, so again, allow me my linguistic, nerd time here. Palashi is a very cool name, very pretty name actually, because it's the name of a tree that has a bright yellow flower, sort of yellow orangey flower. And this extremely important battle, the Battle of Palashi, or the Battle of Plassey as most people know it, happens in 1757. And the essential part of the battle, right, is Robert Clive at the head of a British East India Company force, where he's faced up against what's called the Nawab, or the governor of Bengal, because by this point, the Mughal Empire is so fractured that each province, mainly restricted to the north of India, has its own governor and is semi-independent. He's facing off essentially against the Bengalis, who are based at a place that no one really knows about today anymore, called Murshidabad. It's still there, it's still in Bengal, but the big city now is Kolkata. I wonder why, I wonder who wins at the end of this. But the only reason the British win, the French are actually also backing, the native Bengalis against the British. But anyway, the only reason that they end up on top is Clive is essentially screwed, right? He's surrounded at one point. He's messed up. But just as he's about to be crushed by these Indian troops, there is a monsoon rain, a really heavy downpour. And the British keep their gunpowder dry. This is, I'm not making this up, this actually happened. The British keep their gunpowder dry, whereas their enemies don't. And right after the rains stop, the British have the upper hand. And as the battle sort of seems to swing, Clive's true skullduggery shows itself, because before this battle, he has been, sending spies out to bribe some of the local Indian, Mughal elite who are up in the higher circles of Bengal. And a part of, the enemy army actually switches sides and starts fighting for Clive. Whatever. He wins at the Battle of Plassey. He takes Bengal, and, other stuff happens in the meantime, but the big, thing that historians will always point to, because there was a treaty signed at the end of it, is 7 years later at the battle, what's called the Battle of Buxar. At the end of the Battle of Buxar, 1764, 1765, there is something called the Treaty of Allahabad. And this is really where essentially the British Empire, remember we're still talking about the British East India Company here, not the British Empire, but they're sort of the same thing, and you'll see why. At the Treaty of Allahabad, the Mughal Emperor, which still, despite the fractured nature of the Mughal state, holds a lot of sway, is very important in the consciousness, especially of North India, right? The South, as like any of you who know Indian history will know, holds out a lot longer and is a lot harder for the British to conquer in the end. But they get to the north. The Mughal emperor holds a lot of sway in the north. The north, remember, the Mughals are Muslim, so the north has been under a Muslim ruling elite for a long time. And whatever the Mughal emperor does sort of defines what the north of India looks like. And he is forced to sign what's called the Diwani rights. This means that the British can now collect revenue and administer civil justice. They are essentially now the government. A private company are now the government of North India. And they get those three provinces we mentioned in the beginning: Bengal, Odisha, and Bihar. The most profitable provinces in the entire Indian subcontinent, where all the linens and the cloth comes from. Okay, this used to, and still would have, if the Mughal emperor and the governor, the Nawab of Bengal, the Indian governor of Bengal had held onto it, would have generated enormous revenue for local Indians. Now it's generating it for a private British company with a headquarters in London. Okay? Now, what happens as a result of this? Well, you can sort of track everything that happens after to this moment, because the British Empire, and what did we say? The Mughal Empire, right, was a lot stronger and a lot more powerful than the British up until, essentially the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, and still is at this time, 1765. But now the British have access to the Mughals' wealth. And what did we say? It was 40% of world GDP. Now, if the British take control of that 40%, they're not getting all of India's wealth here, but literally, like those three provinces, Bihar, Bengal, and Odisha, are the lion's share of India's economy, okay? Because just the Ganges is an incredibly fertile area, especially near where it flows out into the sea. It's like the Nile Delta, or the Tigris and the Euphrates, or the Indus in Pakistan. It's an incredibly lush environment where you can just grow essentially whatever you want. And the British now have it. And what are they going to do with it? What, do we think about late 1800s, 1760s, 1770s? Of course, the Industrial Revolution. 1765 lines up incredibly tightly with the start of the Industrial Revolution in England. And that's not a coincidence, because this wealth, this taxation that now happens. So there's a really sinister sort of circle that happens here. The British, after this treaty that they've signed with the Mughal emperor, can now tax their Indian, subjects, essentially. This they can then use to buy Indian goods. So they're essentially getting them for free. And then a private company, remember, can ship these back to England and sell these things and get 100% of the profits, okay? And most of this money, like these British guys are not staying in India their whole life. They're making a fortune, these merchants essentially with swords, they're making a fortune and then they're going back to England. And Clive is, the perfect paragon of this. He makes an absolute fortune. He personally raids, the treasuries of the Bengalis. Goes in there, just takes whatever he wants. And his castle, you can still visit it. It's still there in Wales today, and it still has a bunch of Indian crap stuffed in there. It's called Powys Castle in Wales. Look it up. This is Robert Clive's ancestral castle, stuffed full of Indian goods. Still, it's in a private collection now. And he has so much sway and money that he's one of these things that are called a rotten borough in England, apparently, where people with a lot of wealth would buy a seat in Parliament. Clive does this. And there's a famous quote that's attributed to Clive. I think he actually did say this because it's in like the parliamentary records, where he's in the House of Lords, I'm assuming. He bought a lordship, and the other lords are cross with him because they say, you're just a corrupt official who took, a company, private investor official who went into Bengal and looted everything. And he apparently stands up and he goes, "My lords, I am, astounded at my own moderation," implying that, he could have taken so much more. And apparently he gets a big laugh out of that. That tells you everything you need to know about the House of Lords at that point. So we have all this wealth flowing back to the UK. And what are they using it for? They're using it to build up their, industrial machinery. To fund, I never knew like exactly what the Industrial Revolution was, in its raw form. Apparently at the start, in England anyway, which was the center of it, they were mainly using it, these new machines to automate the clothes and the cloth industry. So they would get cotton from wherever they could, whether it be the American South, before America becomes independent, right, in 1775. But the American South, the Caribbean, India, they're getting all this cotton and they're turning it into cloth that's made not by Bengali weavers anymore, but by machines. And the British know that the biggest manufacturer of clothes and cloth are exactly the territories that they now have dominion over. So they can very easily suppress this. There's even a gory detail where they cut off the thumbs at one point of a lot of the weavers so they can't weave anymore on their, looms that are not mechanized. And in this, twist of fate, really, sparked by, a 7 years war as well that decimates Europe, ends in 1763, that 7 years war I was talking about. Britain ends up on top of that with skirmishes all over the globe. They'll go on to lose America in 1775, with George Washington and all that stuff. But, despite this, they've captured India, which is by far the most important thing for them. Because they, 40% of the world's GDP, they now have access to essentially what used to be the golden goose, this wealth, absolute treasure chest for the Mughal Empire. It's now in the hands of a private British company, and a lot of these officials, a lot of these, company servicemen now become the most wealthy and powerful men in England. And they fund essentially the Industrial Revolution. This money funds the Industrial Revolution, funnels all the way back to England. And we can flow on from that essentially, from there, when the British Empire, is at its height, mid-1850s, even like up until the World Wars, right? India is still the center of this. India just has so much, wealth and production capacity that the British keep on, getting revenue from it. And I mentioned it in the last episode as well. Winston Churchill, at the end of World War II, does not want to give up India. He hates the idea of, Indian independence because he knows his history, and he knows that the British Empire is based, built essentially on Indian wealth. Of course, there are other things too, right? The British were good at, sailing ships. They were good pirates. They were good, in producing, military advancements, whatever. Would they have conquered the world without the capture of India? Like, almost certainly not, right? Because at the end of the day, it comes back to money. And I just love the expression of the golden goose. They could just essentially just think of the British as having this golden goose in a cage. The goose is India, and it keeps laying golden eggs, right? They can just take it all. It's essentially like I'll end on this. So the Spanish Empire, for those of you who listened to my first few episodes on that, the Spanish Empire almost had a similar thing with the Americas, where they went in, they found all these precious metals everywhere, and they could just take them straight back to Spain. And this was a bit earlier, right? This was, Columbus went in 1492, and then mid-1500s, the Spanish Empire is booming. It's, committing a bunch of atrocities in the Americas, mining all this silver from Bolivia, and it just has so much money it doesn't know what to do with it. Or it does know it funds a bunch of wars with it, essentially, right? But to my understanding, at this point, there had never been, such a big influx of wealth, at least in Europe, right? China and other places had already figured it out. And inflation caught up with the Spanish. Everything became so expensive, essentially because they had too much money, and they bankrupted themselves. It was a product of their own success, for want of a better term. By the 1750s, 1770s, we already have sort of the precursor to what would become actual mechanized factories with an assembly line and so on. And people, the Dutch pioneered this, I think, but people in Europe knew how to deal with, the economic side of this. And they knew that as long as you have a market to sell to, right, you can keep producing stuff. And people, essentially, if you control the entire world with your navy, you can force people to buy things off you. So it's a combination of a bunch of different factors, but I don't see what happens with the British in India as any different to what happened to the Spanish in the Americas. The only crucial difference is that by the time it happened to the British, they had better systems to cope with all the wealth. And they knew that, they knew what to do with it. And they knew, essentially, how to dominate the world from it. And we've only very recently come out of this. I would even put the recent sort of American dominance since World War II as a legacy of this, right? Because the European implant in the Americas that decimated, the indigenous population there was started off by the British Empire. Crazy, crazy things. In the 1700s, right? Whilst this India stuff is happening as well. I'll leave it there. Just let you stew on that. And, come at me in the comments if you think that this isn't, the real reason why the British Empire still pervades, everything in the West, and why perhaps large parts of the world, India included, are very glad to be rid of it. Stay curious. Thank you for listening, and we'd love to hear your thoughts about whether India was the key to, the British domination of the world. Thank you very much.